Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for coming today and celebrating our mother. Um, as you know, we have rescheduled this 4 times, so we appreciate you sticking by us all this time. So anyway, I don't know if you all know, I'm Isabel. I'm Jane's eldest child. So on behalf of my sisters, brother, and our families, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming this afternoon. And thank you again for rolling with the punches during our many schedule changes. We are thrilled that you can be with us or on Zoom. And I'm sure that all of you know, by the second time we rescheduled it, my mother would say, you just go have dinner on me, so. So first, a little housekeeping. For those of you who are on Zoom, please make sure that your microphone is mute. I believe it should be. Look at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and you should see the mute button. It's best to view the service using the speaker view instead of seeing everybody's pictures. And that would be on the upper right-hand corner. Throughout the past 2 years, my family has received so many touching notes from you all and many others. Each note told us what a large impact Mom had on your lives. I always knew that my mother was an unrelenting advocate for the underrepresented. She fought for immigrants, the poor, and those requiring specialized education. My mother also, as many of you know, was a devoted friend. Her friends were friends for life, as witnessed by all of you here today. But to me, she was just Mom, and much more importantly, the grandma to my 4 children. Mom had a unique and special relationship with each of her 9 grandchildren. She thoroughly enjoyed spending time with them as young adults. And I bet if you asked each of them, they would tell you that they were grandma's favorite. True, right, Delia? She's sitting right there. In saying of all of this, it gives me great comfort that my mother spent her last days with one of her oldest friends and her eldest grandchild exploring San Francisco. As hard as it has been to lose her, I am so glad that in her last days, she was doing what she loved with the people that she loved. And now I would like to introduce my sister, Emily.
Oh boy, okay. Been 2 years. This isn't on my piece of paper, but you guys are gonna have to bear with me because I'm not sure I can get through this, but I'm gonna do my best. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily, Jane's 3rd of 4 children. And I begin, like my sister, with thanking you for joining us today to celebrate my mom. You've donned masks, you've gotten on planes and trains, you've repeatedly reorganized your schedules and submitted proof of vaccination. Some of you are plugged in and Zooming from across the country and other time zones. My siblings and I are deeply grateful to all of you for your presence, your generosity of spirit and love. We also thank the many other friends and family members who sent us beautiful messages about Jane with heartfelt regrets at having to miss this gathering. It's a great relief to be finally having this memorial after the long COVID delays. Not having been able to honor and celebrate Jane in the way that she deserves has been weighing on us. It will be 2 years on Monday since my mom unexpectedly died at the end of a wonderful visit to San Francisco to see my nephew Jacob, her eldest grandchild. She was 86 years old, sharp as a tack and going strong. While the shock of her death has diminished with the passage of time, the profound loss remains. And coming together with all of you to exchange our remembrances of Jane and to celebrate her is enormously comforting. The crowd assembled here and on Zoom is a clear testament to Jane and the strength of her relationships. With us today are Jane's children, our spouses and partners, her 9 grandchildren and their spouses and partners, her friends and colleagues from nearly every stage of her life. Standing here brings to my mind many memories of my mom, standing before a room of family, friends, or members of her community to make a toast or deliver a speech. She was always perfectly poised, had exactly the right words, and struck the precise tone to capture the essence of the person being honored or the moment being marked. Indeed, I remember being in this very room and listening to Jane memorialize her dear friend, Joan Sexton, and speaking generously about my father, her ex-husband, at his memorial service. Jane set a standard that I can only aspire to. As you will see, I do not have the composure or the words, and we frankly don't have the time on today's program for me to fully express how important my mom was and will always be to me. Simply put, she was a truly remarkable person, and I'm deeply fortunate to have had her as a parent and a role model. Jane led a life that was meaningful and defined by her engagement and commitment to her family, her friends, her community, and her ideals. She was exemplary in all aspects of her life as a woman, an advocate, a friend, colleague, citizen, and of course, as a mother and a grandmother. Jane, without question, was a force. She was an interesting and engaging person who was highly accomplished. But despite the Ivy League education, she was no elitist. And one of the attributes that I admired most about my mother was her humility. It was not about her. Instead, her attention was outward facing. Her focus was on what she could do for others. And just yesterday, my boss, the Attorney General, Tish James, invoked a quote from Martin Luther King, which crossed my email and Karen's and Paula's, who are here today, and Jim on the Zoom. And she called our attention to this statement from Dr. King. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? This sentiment defined Jane's life. Jane had a lifelong commitment to advancing social justice and equity. And as you will hear later in the program from Jane's colleagues, she used her intellect, tenacity, and creativity to advocate for and support quality public education, humane immigration policies, and the delivery of critical social services for impoverished New Yorkers, among many other causes. Jane brought the same kind of attention and care to her friendships, which lasted for decades. Jane was an only child with a small family circle, given that her father, George, was an orphan and an immigrant from England, and her mother, Till, was the rebel in her family. Jane's cousins on her mother's side, the Bergsons, were an important extension of her immediate family, and Jane spent summers with them at the camp her uncle and aunt ran and continued to have warm relationships with them throughout her life, as you will hear from Rayla Temin, one of Jane's cousins. And also sharing their remembrances today are Jane's friends, dating back to the late 1950s at law school in New Haven, in the early 1960s when she was a young mother raising her 4 kids in Park Slope. These friendships were a mainstay of Jane's life and the community that she created. Indeed, the children of Jane's friends developed their own fondness for her, and Bernie Graham, whose mother, Nancy, was one of my mom's dearest friends, will also be speaking. Jane's most important role to me personally was as the strong and loving matriarch of our family. She created, nurtured, and endlessly supported each and every one of us. Despite the substantial responsibilities she's assumed in the other realms of her life, and she did not retire until she was 75, we were her highest priority. Her free time revolved around her family. She was the one to spearhead and organize family vacations, holiday meals, and celebrations of the latest family accomplishment or milestone. She was the one who never missed a birthday and made sure that the rest of us also did not by sending us email reminders. She was integrally involved in each of our lives, always engaged and interested in what we were doing and ready to provide advice when we were facing a decision about a next step. whether personally or professionally. No one took greater pride in us or more enthusiastically supported our endeavors. Jane was undoubtedly the center of our universe, and we happily orbited around her. Finally, for me, Jane was a beacon. She has led and inspired me at each and every stage of my life. She is why I was a dancer, a wife, a mother, and now an attorney working in the public interest. It has been incredibly hard not to have my mom's counsel and support these past 2 years. But I have the benefit of 57 years of having the very best model a person could have for leading an engaging, rich, and purposeful life. She will always be my inspiration and ideal, and I will do my very best to emulate her. So again, thanks to all of you for being here and being a part of this celebration. And we're going to next do, I hope, have Rayla Temin zoom in from Madison, Wisconsin, and let's see if we can master this.
Hello, I am here, Emily. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
That was Emily before. Okay.
Okay.
That was Isabel. No.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you for giving me this opportunity to offer some memories of my dear and generous and very classy cousin, Jane.
Mm.
I will tell a bit of family history, that part reaching back to our maternal grandmother. Am I being heard and seen on the Zoom? Yeah? Oh, okay. I will tell a bit of family history, that part reaching back to our maternal grandmother, and I will touch upon some amazing coincidences in recent eras that bolstered the friendships between our families. Our mothers were sisters, mine named Lillian and Jane's Matilda.
We can't hear you yet.
You can't?
Can you just go to the speakers view? There she is.
Shall I continue? Yes. Our mothers were sisters, mine named Lillian and Jane's Matilda, known as Lily and Tilly or Till. They were the two youngest children of our grandmother Jenny, born in 1865 in Suwałki, a great seat for Jewish learning in Lithuania. As a young woman, Jenny immigrated on her own to New York, where she met and married Henry Berkson. They had 8 children, including an older brother to Lily and Tilly named Isaac, descendants of whom are with us today on the Zoom. Jane grew up in Manhattan, I in Brooklyn, and in the summers we attended Camp Moden in Maine, one of the first Zionist nature outdoorsy camps in the US, founded in 1922 by a trio of Jewish educators known as the Benderly Boys and their spouses. Isaac Berkson was one of the Benderly Boys, and thus he and his wife Libby were one of the founding pairs, Libby ultimately becoming the sole director. Jane had attended Seders at the home of her Aunt Libby and Uncle Isaac. And Camp Moden, especially with the Berkson family connection, was a formative experience for each of us. As an example, Jane maintained a lifelong bond with her Moden friend, Janet Robertson, even up to Jane's last visit in San Francisco, those 2 years ago, illustrative of Jane's continuing devotion and loyalty to her friends. Jane Schreiber was 3 years older than I and noticeably taller, and she dressed up in beautiful dresses. As a young girl, I was the beneficiary of those, receiving them as hand-me-downs. They were hemmed for me by my paternal grandfather, Yussel, a tailor. My father, Morris Greenberg, and Jane's father, George Schreiber, had in common that they were both born in England, although my father came to the US at age 3 and George Schreiber at some point later. Morris and George knew each other at City College. And the story is that Morris, who was engaged to Lily for 7 years, told George that Lily had a sister, Tilly, and that is how George and Till met. I left Brooklyn for Madison, Wisconsin in 1956 to attend graduate school at the university, never thinking that I would spend the next 6.5 decades so far away from family in New York, especially my parents and 3 younger siblings, Riffy, Gershon, and Jenny Greenberg. But I met Howard Temin there, and we married and raised our daughters, Sarah and Miriam, in Madison, and we stayed on. Howard and I were married in New York at the St. Moritz Hotel overlooking Central Park, and the Schreibers were there. George Schreiber was one of the 2 signers of our ketubah, the wedding contract. But it was in Madison where Jane and I really reconnected in a significant way when Emily came to law school at the UW in 1991, accompanied by Jane to help find housing. As part of her training, Emily interned with Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the late Shirley Abrahamson, a close family friend. Shirley was very fond of Emily and praised her work in the court. We Temins were delighted to get to know Emily and Scott and wrap them into our family life, and to see Jane on the several occasions when she came to visit, including for Emily's graduation in 1994. However, those 3 years included the time when Howard became ill and died after a short interval. So Jane and Emily and the Stern family shared directly in that very sad passage with us. But we all became closer, and we treasure that closeness until this day.
There's me sitting over there.
After Howard died, Jane kindly invited me to visit, starting in 1995, staying at Shay Jane's B&B, her lovely apartment on Columbus Avenue, appointed in such good taste. And I did so for many visits over the next 25 years until June 2019. Every day started out with a report by Jane of what was in the New York Times, often rendered with great concern. Then, as we breakfasted together, where she presented fresh berries in a beautiful ceramic bowl, or later in the day, we would talk about our lives. Jane shared tales reflecting, above all, her deep devotion to her family. And she spoke about her professional work, her friends, her cultural pursuits, her theater tickets, her literature courses at Columbia after she retired. Jane was so engaged in living life to its fullest. Some of my visits included Berkson family simchas, such as bar and bat mitzvah, that Jane and I attended together. And some were for Stern family events, such as Jane's fabulous 70th birthday party. She made the most of every opportunity to celebrate. In turn, Jane visited me in Madison, most recently in 2019, when we went to the UW Arboretum and sat on a bench under the beautiful blossoming crabapple trees, and we talked and talked. A passerby, seemingly captivated by these octogenarians in deep conversation, wearing our big straw hats, asked to take our photo, which we permitted. Over the years, we shared so much kinship. Jane was empathic and supportive and understanding, dedicated to those close to her and to the larger society. She was a woman of determination and fortitude and resolve. She cared passionately and thoughtfully about so many pending issues. With her distinguished career and her deeds of tikkun olam, repairing the world, Jane did so much to help others. Jane's hospitality to me over those years was unbounded, and most unexpectedly and fortuitously turned out to be most convenient as well. That is, in 2003, my daughter Miriam, having lived and worked abroad, returned to the US and moved to New York. And where did she settle but in an apartment just 4 blocks away from Jane? And Sarah has often visited Miriam there. I recently reread some of Jane's letters to me, in one of which she wrote, "I have enjoyed so much getting to know Sarah and Miriam as nieces. That is, even with her own very large and close immediate family, Jane enveloped us too, there in the Columbus Avenue upper 70s corridor." Miriam's son Micah was born in 2008, and he too is a fan of our beloved Jane, along with his own special ties to Maddie and Ben, Delia and Neil, Lucian, and the others. Thus, strengthened by Jane and her clan, our connections through cousinhood have spanned 5 generations, Lador, from generation to generation. Jane leaves such a beautiful legacy. May her memory be for a blessing. Thank you.
Need to test it.
Testing, can people hear me? This is, on this one, is this my,
No, I just want to get you.
oh, okay. I apologize for all our.
Yeah, you should be on.
Okay,
You're on.
am I on?
Yeah.
Okay, just saying, I know I picked up a lot of computer skills, Emily too, along the way, but thank goodness for Oscar. And, you know, you guys just have to bear with us. We're still trying to persevere. Anyway, I'd like to introduce my Aunt Margie, our only aunt, my brother, my father's sister,
Thank you. One is going to see a pattern in these eulogies. I'm so pleased that I brought my typed copy. I don't want anyone to think I was stealing ideas from someone else that were just presented to me. My brother brought Jane to meet his family in 1956. It was a time of great anticipation. I was so thrilled at the thought of a sister-in-law. At this period, Jane and Louis were in their first year of law school, and I was a junior in high school. My parents, I suspect, although they never said anything, were probably a little concerned about how Greenwich Village was going to meet Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. There was an immediate consensus, and it was unanimous. Jane was a keeper. On June 1956, Louis and Jane were married. Before their second anniversary, and during my first semester in college, my mother died. Jane, who never was one to take over, she was not a takeover person, but she kept the family together. We were, of course, in Pennsylvania. She was in New Haven and Brooklyn in New York. But she would have Thanksgiving. She would have our family, being my father, myself, and my aunt. She'd have us for dinner. And she really kept, for me, who the youngest was, it was just a feeling of family, that I still had a family. That the fact that my mother was gone, of course it was a loss, but this was something that was sort of the new phase. Check my notes here. After law school, as you will hear, as have heard, Jane had a wonderful career and devoted to the underprivileged and underrepresented, as Emily said. She carried her academic and her career successes lightly. She was very modest. I found out things about her that I didn't know until I read her obituary. The flip side of her modesty, she had no tolerance for ego, for self congratulations, or anything that was showing. She knew it. She could feel it immediately. For me, Jane was a model of the high standards of ethical behavior. More than once, I asked myself, what would Jane think of this person? What would Jane do in this situation? In addition, Jane mentored my New York experience. She recommended plays to see. She listed art exhibits that I should attend. And of course, that famous, I liked Rada's Chez Jane. I also was a beneficiary of Chez Jane and her hospitality over many, many years. In summary, I have lost a friend and an influencer, and I have missed her.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just adjust this. My earliest memories of my grandmother were when she would read to me, when I would sit on her lap and she'd open up a color book or a storybook, and we'd share a story together. Many of you in this room have also done that favor to me, but I don't mean to insult you, but she really was the best. And it wasn't because she was a very theatrical person when she talked. She didn't do voices like the rest of you did. But she really did put an effort into finding a lesson in this, making every story count. And she leaned into the idea of, when she was reading to me, she would try and make me think and take it seriously. I think she tried this throughout everything she did with me, but the thing that she made reading to, pardon, I'm a little flustered. My grandmother took story time with me very seriously. I came to understand later when I learned to read. I was slow to read. It took me a little longer than others. And she in particular was always talking to my parents, talking to me about what I was using to read, what I was reading, what books I was trying with, how I was looking at the page. And I came to understand later in life that all that time reading to me, she really had a direct purpose to it. She was looking into the future when I would come and grow and how she wanted to influence me and what kind of person I would become. I think part of the reason my grandmother was able to touch so many people in this room, so many people are watching over Zoom, is because every single interaction she had with people, she really tried to take it very seriously and think about how it would affect those around her, how it would matter down the line, not just in the moment, not the temporary pleasures, not how it would make her feel, but how it would blossom into something that was rewarding for the community around her. And I think part of what I later learned about my grandmother, her life growing up, her complicated family story, how she was a trailblazer professionally, how she was an important mother through tough times. I think part of what gave her that engine was that she really did not shy away from showing how much she loved or cared. Even when other people might have thought it was embarrassing, other people thought it was limiting, it was something that would come off tacky, she took every moment painfully seriously, even when she was making a joke. I had the chance, unlike a lot of people, I think, I had the chance to know my grandmother as an adult when I moved back to New York City. And I think she very much was my best friend here. She was someone I could talk to about anything. And again, when I would talk to her about any subject, whether it was a book we'd both read or it was, something very pivotal in my life. I was staying with my grandfather for a long time while his health was deteriorating. Our relationship was complicated. She always took the moment. Every bit of advice she gave to me, it was never something that was just sort of pat and simple. She really took the moment to think and give me something concrete. And I knew that, she looked at me as somebody who was half-formed, who was moving along in life, finding my way. But she really treated me like an adult, like no one else did. And she really showed me what it was to be both responsible to other people, but also to be a leader. To me, my grandmother really epitomized what it meant to be a matriarch, to be the head of a family, and to look down as an adult at other adults and have more experience than them and still try and guide them while respecting who they were. And I think that part of what I hope to carry on from my grandmother is that when I interact with others, I remember what she always told me, which was not to put yourself first, not to think about what this works for you, but how it works for everyone else. So even though she grew into a life of status, I think of privilege in a lot of ways by her own doing, I think that she always was able to turn that around and make that work for other people. As everyone else has said, she did not have a strong ego, but I think she had a strong sense of purpose, and she always kept to that. As many other people will notice in this room too, my grandmother talked about her own death quite a bit, for a lot longer than she needed to. I think probably my early teens, I remember so many times my grandmother talking about, I could be gone at any minute. Don't get used to me. And she would say it very frankly, sometimes humorously, sometimes not. Some of that, I think, was her dealing with the loss of many good friends. Some of that, I think, was her very much trying to process just the difficult world she often was living in. But I think, again, she was being very seriously, very intentionally trying to confront the issue that she wanted her family, who very clearly depended on her for so much, they wanted them to be ready to carry on without her, to carry on what she taught them, and to take what she had given them and let it bloom. So I guess what I would hope we can all get from this, and I'm so glad we're all here today to share this memory, is to remember how much she gave to us, how she loved us unconditionally, and she loved us without any hesitation. I think if we can carry on that would be the thing she would want the most, more than the cookies, more than more than any dedicated park bench or anything like that. I think if we can carry on that feeling, she'd appreciate that the most. And again, I just want to say I feel blessed to have known her love. Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I thought I was gonna be in an easier place, but that was great, Ben. Um, I'm Delia. I am the youngest of Jane's 9 grandchildren. And talking to you all today, I simply cannot, with any of the brevity that she requested we exercise in talking about her, reasonably sum up all that I adored about my grandma Jane. Nor can I broach the tip of her influence on who I am today and who I want to be tomorrow. I've been trying to articulate that for the past 2 years, and I think I'll be trying to explain what she means to me for the rest of my life to anyone who will listen. So instead, I can share with you all something that I hope will resonate about one of the key ways I experienced Jane showing her love, which was time spent together. I haven't had that many last days and last words in my life yet, I'm 23, but I understand that they can be somewhat fickle. And in the case of Jane, I feel very, very lucky to have spent a last day with her that was so perfect, so routine, and so very Jane. I hope some of the details of this particular September day will remind you of all the teas and exhibits and discussions and desserts that you might have shared with her. It was right before I went back to school for my junior year at college, and she'd set our date for the Basquiat show at the Guggenheim. And one could always count on Jane Stern to know exactly the exhibit, gallery show, or play that we had to see at any moment in time. And like so many of the amazing things I've gotten to see in my life, I never would have seen this without her. So after the requisite reminder voicemail that morning detailing the time and place that we'd planned to meet, which I'm sure other grandchildren are familiar with, I approached the museum to see her waiting patiently in her very brightly colored ensemble outside the white rotunda of the Guggenheim building. I remember the delight it gave her when I presented my Northwestern ID for a discount and found that the boy at the ticketing desk was an alum himself. She asked his major, and when given a more practical answer than my major, theater, she joked that upon graduation, I probably wouldn't even be able to get this job. Those of you all know Jane Stern. She didn't have any disdain for that job. She didn't have any disdain for my pursuit of theater. In fact, she was always me and my brother Neil's greatest champion in that regard, by immeasurably. But she knew a good joke when she saw it. And then we did the museum like two very, very well-trained New Yorkers. And she was the one who trained me. So we start from the top, and then you work your way all the way down, beginning in the special exhibit, and then ending, of course, in the cafe. And her small remarks in my ear in the Basquiat show illuminated and complicated my experience of looking at the work. That was always one of my favorite things about seeing any show or play with her. You could feel the decades of knowledge about and love for the thing in her little comments here and there. And like everybody said, she wasn't showy, they were little. But you walked out with this entirely deeper experience simply by virtue of attending in her presence. At this point, 2 years ago, she was no longer strolling down Wright's ramp with the ease she had in years past, but we made our way, finally taking a breather in front of Robert Mapplethorpe's images from the Black Book, a notorious and highly controversial series in which Mapplethorpe depicts Black men's body nearly all in nudes, the most famous of which in this series are just photos of phalluses, very, very close up. Yeah, that was where my grandmother wanted to take a break. It was not exactly comfortable work to look at, even on one's own, and definitely not with your grandmother. But when I looked to her to see any flinch or sign of discomfort on her face, I only saw the spark of genuine interest. An unflinching force in all things, she looked at this domineering wall of pornographic, racist work, and she didn't want to shy away or turn away or ignore it. She wanted to dig in and talk to me about the nuance of what it meant. Was it exploitative, adoring, obsessive? And so she and I sat there and we discussed it. And classic Jane, at the terminus of several more of these highly intellectual conversations about somehow even more explicit works, she turned to me and asked if, maybe now was a good time to go get a cup of tea, maybe share a cookie. And so we landed, as was custom with her, in the cafe with 2 cups of tea, a shared sandwich, and an almond croissant. And then for an hour, we sat there sharing our snacks while she asked me hundreds of questions about my upcoming semester at school, which she was always very proud of. She always pivoted our talks back to me and to my work. She's so fascinating as a person and yet so uninterested in herself, as my mom said before, and ever the supportive patron of the arts. She was asking me all these detailed questions about my approach to the play I was directing that semester. And I remember very specifically from that day that the question she asked was so specific and so thoughtful that I left that afternoon with all of these new ideas. It was like a completely generative experience talking to her. And when I gave her a kiss goodbye and put her in a cab headed back across town, I, of course, had no idea that that was the last time I'd spend an afternoon that way with her. But I feel unbelievably lucky to have spent as many afternoons as I did that way with her. Of course, I wish I had 20 more years of these shared cups of tea, of being told to stop spinning in her chairs, of seeing her dance at Passover to Outkast songs, of watching movies in her bed because it was the only place in her apartment that you could. I really wish I had all the time with her, but I'm an unbelievably lucky person because I got to be the grandchild of Jane Sturt. My brother is going to come up and we're going to sing a song, which he'll tell you more about.
So this song, one of the things Grandma requested, other than that not all of her grandchildren speak, was that there be some music, and she specifically suggested something from her youth, sort of folky, her Greenwich Village upbringing. And so we picked a Woody Guthrie song called Roll On Columbia, which is about a WPA Works project, which feels very connected to her, the ethos that she grew up with. So. Green Douglas firs where the waters cut through, down her wild mountains and canyons she flew, Canadian northwest of the ocean so blue. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Other great rivers add power to you, Yakima Snake and the Clicket Tattoo, Sandy Willamette and the Hood River too. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. At Bonneville now there are ships in the locks. The waters have risen and cleared all the rocks. Shiploads of plenty will steam past the docks. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. And up on the river is Grand Coulee Dam, the mightiest dam ever built by a man, to run the great factories and water the land. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. These might men labored by day and by night, matching their strength against the river's wild flight. Through rapids and falls they won the hard fight. So roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. Your power is turning our darkness to dawn. Roll on, Columbia, roll on. And now, to commence the colleague section, I'm going to be reading something written by Margie McHugh, her remembrance of my grandmother. So this is Margie speaking, not me. Yes, great. First, let me express my deep sympathy to Jane's family, Isabel, Jillian, Emily, and Tom, their spouses, and her grandchildren, each of whom were so dear to her and whose unique aspirations,
challenges, and accomplishments I know were always top of mind for Jane and closely bound to her heart. I am surprised that with the innumerable vivid memories I have of her, I don't remember my first meeting with Jane, which would have been in 1990 when she was a program officer at the New York Community Trust. However, I remember quite well the high levels of anxiety surrounding the meeting, both my own and that of some members of the board of directors of the New York Immigration Coalition, where I had recently been hired as the group's executive director. Jane was well known to many of them, given her role coordinating the Fund for New Citizens, a collaborative fund created by the trust to both support implementation of a legalization program passed several years earlier by the Congress and more generally respond to immigrant community needs in the city. In retrospect, it's easy to understand the worry. Yes, Jane was a funder, almost by definition a cause for worry, but worse, she was also someone who had immense experience and success as a legal and policy advocate, and who knew what it took to build a high-functioning organization and be effective working, sometimes against and sometimes with large government systems. And she was smart, strategic, and understood the intersectionality of key social issues like education, immigration, and economic justice long before that was a word heard outside the walls of academia. Boy, now there's a challenge for a new executive director and a fledgling organization. Good thing I didn't know at the time what a deeply and chronically impatient person she was. Though, of course, over time, that became my favorite thing about her. Her mostly quiet but always simmering impatience with the many things she saw going wrong in systems that mattered so much to the life and future of New York. She certainly spent her career doing more than her part to fix those wrongs, missed opportunities, and weak system or community capacities. In the immigration arena, she and her colleagues at the Fund for New Citizens and the Community Trust led the nation in expanding legal services for unrepresented immigrants, building the capacities of dozens of diverse immigrant community groups to serve and represent the interest of their communities, and nurturing the evolution of the New York Immigration Coalition as it became a voice for over 200 organizations in the state and lead actor in national immigration and immigrant integration policy spheres. In the midst of those many groundbreaking initiatives, I must mention two particular efforts Jane leaned into that made a huge impression on me and a huge difference for others. One was her work to ensure the needs of immigrant workers and families were not overlooked in the response to the September 11th terrorist attacks in New York. While confusion and fear still reigned in the early days following those attacks, I received a call from Jane, and after an extended silence as we composed ourselves, she said in a voice soft but full of fire, "Those people need lawyers." She was referring to immigrants attempting to navigate the disaster intake center that had been established at the Hudson River Piers, the central intake hub where those heavily impacted by the disaster were sent for help. In the days and weeks that followed, Jane worked closely with other community trust and foundation colleagues, as well as legal services and community groups in my organization's network to stand up not just legal services, but a range of other tailored supports and processes to ensure the losses experienced by immigrant workers and families could be fairly and equitably addressed. The other prominent initiative has to do with the system most often the focus of Jane's ire and exasperation, New York City's public schools. More is being said by others today about Jane's deep commitment to improving public education, but I must pay tribute to the efforts she made to help immigrant community and education advocates embark upon a multi-year partnership researching the experiences of immigrant students in the city's schools. It was an intimidating foray for both, and one for which the institutional relationships and analytic foundation would need to be built over several years. But Jane's clear vision and soft diplomacy touched off many years of collaboration and successful advocacy on funding and other reforms to improve educational services for immigrant students and their families. While it was reassuring that Jane's sense of urgency regarding the need to level the playing field and close opportunity gaps in society didn't wane after her retirement from the trust, it pained me that she would occasionally reflect on, frankly, what a mess things still were. Of course, she could acknowledge where important and hard-won gains had been made and would concede the scenarios where things could have turned out worse, with the exception of one particular presidential election. But her frustration was obvious. At those times, I would remind her when she was out in her beloved city to think of the many hardworking New Yorkers she had helped legal services to reach, or the countless youth her efforts had helped to benefit from effective instruction and programming, or the many organizations vital to the life of the city that she had helped to grow and thrive, and know that truly she had made a remarkable difference in the life of the city. While I didn't hide and I didn't detect any eye rolls at those moments, and maybe she had just gotten better at hiding her hallmark impatience and exasperation. Rest in peace, dear Jane. Know that the work continues. Your investments in New York's people, institutions, and services will long continue to bear fruit. And the many of us who learn from your fine example are as impatient and determined as ever.
Go ahead. Hi, my name is Kim Sweet. I'm the Executive Director of Advocates for Children of New York. And I want to thank the family for asking me to speak today. I'm really honored, as Jane was someone I really so much admired. Having been the Executive Director for the last 14 years, I have come to the conclusion that no one in the organization's illustrious 50-year history has done more for Advocates for Children than Jane Stern. I know that Jane would scoff at that statement and probably cut me off right now. She would point to all the brilliant and dedicated people that have poured their talent and their passion into Advocates for Children and played critical roles in getting the organization off the ground and getting it where it is today. And that's true. While there certainly were lots of wonderful people who led or contributed to AFC in lots of ways, and some of them are still here today, I do believe that if Advocates for Children ever had a guardian angel, someone who had our back year after year after year, that was Jane Stern. She was there at the organization's inception back in 1971. Isabel told me that she can remember her mother sitting in their living room with Bill Jasinki and others, developing the concept that became Advocates for Children. And it really is a concept that has stood the test of time. In the last 50 years, the organization has had our ups and downs big time, but we have steadfastly maintained the founder's original focus on fighting for disadvantaged students in the New York City public schools. And Jane and her colleagues initially envisioned, and we have documents that show this, that advocacy for individual students and their families were to be at the organization's core. But while we focused on individual students, what they saw is that we could use what we learn in those individual cases to push for policy change. And that is the concept that we still use today because it's been so very effective and so very visionary. From what I can tell, Jane's initial job at Advocates for Children was that she was the sole staff attorney. Does that sound right? Okay. One of our staff members who has a penchant for history recently dug up this old issue of our newsletter from 1977. It was called The Advocate, which is what we still call our newsletter today. And I got to say, it was 40 mimeographed pages of newsletter that, according to the back sheet, you could buy for $1. The newsletter included this crazy story about a case that Jane apparently handled, where a girl was expelled, not suspended, but expelled from Long Island City High School without any sort of due process whatsoever for allegedly talking back to the school secretary. The principal in this case, a guy named Hurwitz, I don't know if that rings a bell for anybody here. Yes? Okay. Yeah, he was a real doozy. He was really defiant, and he went to the media to plead his case. And what I really loved about the story, which is a huge, long, fascinating story, but what I really loved about it was that the principal tried to disparage Jane in the press by calling her, and I quote, a meddlesome poverty lawyer. I really liked that, a meddlesome poverty lawyer, and I hope that Jane did too. As if that's not a badge of honor. I have to tell you, our current director of litigation wants us to put that on our t-shirts. So the meddlesome poverty lawyer went on to become Advocates for Children's executive director, helping the organization get its solid footing and build our reputation. And even after she left AFC and went to the New York Community Trust, Jane kept looking out for the organization and giving lots and lots of advice, whether solicited or not, to subsequent executive directors, including me. I have to admit that when I first met Jane, I was pretty much afraid of her. I laughed to hear Margie's explanation because that was my experience as well. I could tell how much Jane cared about Advocates for Children, and I did not want to be the person who let her down. Over the years, the fear turned to appreciation and to admiration as well. With Jane, I always knew that Advocates for Children had someone in our corner, someone who always wanted us to succeed and to thrive. When we decided that it was time to start a leadership circle for donors, I had lunch with Jane at, or breakfast with Jane at Sarah Beth's kitchen, and she became a founding member without hesitation. And she insisted on setting up her 3-year pledge to make sure that AFC would be able to collect even if she died before it became fully due, which, you know, I was like, I don't want to talk about this, that's ridiculous. But sadly, that did become the case. And that's how reliable and conscientious she was, that she had to set this up to make sure, just in case anything happened, that we would collect fully on our donations. So Jane's impact over the years has been tremendous. Literally hundreds of thousands of students have succeeded in school because of the organization that she helped found and nurture. I am so grateful for her life's work. I miss her, and I pledge to maintain her legacy and keep it going in the coming years. So thank you very much.
I did not leave. Well, interestingly enough, my comments are going to get much shorter, as so many people have done such a great job talking about Jane. I am Lori Slutsky, president of the New York Community Trust, and I had the pleasure of working with Jane Stern for 22 years. Jane was hired in 1987, as you can tell from others, after her career at Advocates. She was hired as a program officer to manage the foundation's work in education grant making. As you now know, we hired Jane from one of our star grantees, Advocates for Children, where Jane led the groundbreaking work that Kim just described. So I will not describe it again. I would love to take credit for hiring Jane, because I love to take credit for hiring all the great staff at the New York Community Trust. But I did not hire Jane. She was hired by one of my colleagues. I was kicked over to the management side of the trust at the time Jane came, and so was less involved in grant making. Jane took the education grant making portfolio I had actually managed for years before. I watched Jane improve it. As you have heard by countless speakers today, Jane was deliberate, strategic, and a tireless advocate for the students of New York City's public schools. No one likes to be replaced by someone better in a job than they were, but that is exactly what happened when Jane took my job. Jane was respectfully called the Dean of Education Grant Making. One of her greatest accomplishments was supporting the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. Does not trip off your tongue. It was a lawsuit against the state of New York, which claims that the formula used by the state to fund K through 12 education discriminated against New York City, which had very high numbers of poor and disabled children who needed greater resources to overcome their challenges. The lawsuit lasted more than 15 years. If we had measured success in that case in 1, 3, or 5-year time periods, the Campaign for Fiscal Equity was a big loser, a failure on any metric we could look at. But Jane believed in the merits of the case, and she knew if it were successful, it would probably be the most significant thing she could do for New York City public school children. So she persevered. Not surprisingly, Jane was right. The campaign was ultimately successful, and most people give Jane a large measure of the credit for that work. This year alone, New York City will receive an additional $1.2 billion, yes, $1 billion with a B, because of Jane's work. Jane came to the trust as the education expert, but as only Jane could do, she became an expert in everything she tackled. She focused on the needs of new immigrants, as you've heard in previous speakers. She built the Trust Civil Legal Services portfolio and funded nascent community-based organizations serving immigrants. I think because of Jane's leadership, the New York Community Trust today is the largest funder of private civil legal services in the city of New York, and that was all Jane's work. She built the Fund for New Citizens, and we used Jane, selling her expertise, to attract tens of millions of dollars from other foundations to support this important but underfunded area of work. You've heard she created the New York Immigration Coalition and so many more things. I could go on and on and on about Jane's accomplishments, but so many others have come before me, so I won't. Suffice it to say, Jane was one of a kind, brilliant, a great colleague, remarkably effective, and never wanting credit for anything she did. The only thing I will say that I've heard this morning that I don't agree with is that Jane had no ego. I think it was the fact that she had such a healthy ego that allowed her to give credit to everybody else but herself. So Jane decided to retire. And on June 4th, 2009, the New York Community Trust Board passed a resolution in her honor. It ends essentially saying that we wished her a happy retirement and we expressed our deep thanks for her unwavering commitment and contributions to justice, equality, and opportunity for all New Yorkers. What I want to say today to Jane's children and grandchildren, please know that New York is a far better place for the work your mother and grandmother did, and she left that as a great legacy for you.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you, New York Community Trust. I'm Lucy Sexton, but I'm here first to pass on some words of another person at New York Community Trust, Kerry McCarthy, who I met because I had to go to Kerry to ask for money for my arts organization. And she is, like Jane, known to be very tough and no nonsense and impatient and say what you want. And the first thing I said was, well, my friend Jane Stern used to work at the New York Community Trust. And she said, Jane was my mentor. I said, okay. So these are words from Kerry McCarthy, Vice President for Philanthropic Initiatives. Jane Stern was a force of nature. She had strong opinions, a fierce commitment to justice, and pushed for social change that made New York a kinder and more fair city. I knew her by reputation for years and had the good fortune of working with her at the tail end of her storied career at the New York Community Trust. Jane was admired and respected by her colleagues. Many marveled at how she could get away with saying the things everyone else was thinking but feared verbalizing. She taught me what smart grant making looks like, how to make a case for funding the causes we believed in, and wisely kept us humble. Jane's training as a lawyer and advocate meant that she was a fighter, and nobody fought harder for this city's children and immigrants than her. Her professional legacy will carry on for generations. Thank you, Jane, for all you gave us. Next up, I think we have you, Dad. As my dad comes up, I just do want to say people have talked about what a friend Jane was. I'm so grateful for the friendship, companionship, love, and constancy she showed my dad, particularly in these recent years after my mom's death. Unbelievable. And we're very, very grateful and love Jane very, very much. Okay, come on around.
I'm 92, and I have some problems with my eyes. So I'll read from my script the first paragraph and the last paragraph. And in between, I'll have one of my daughters reading the in between. Well, that was Lucy first.
Yeah, she's right there. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
Look-
she's right there.
Lucy Sexton. She was good, wasn't she? Where am I?
Jane.
Oh. And Jane was in the hospital in San Francisco. Her family called me and said that the doctor had told them that if they held the telephone next close to Jane, it's Jane's ears, she would read them.
She could hear me.
Hmm?
She could hear me.
She could hear me and she could read them. So with my son Michael at my side in Brooklyn, we connected with the phone in her ear in California. And I had a chance to speak to Jane. I said, "Dear Jane, we can be grateful for the love we've shared with you." Michael thought that was okay. And the family also agreed.
My words, these words that he's written, can only mean so much. But fortunately, Jane had recently written up an autobiography, and her words are better than mine. Jane's autobiography was unusual because it was in response to a letter from her friend, Bill Felsner. Bill was writing about a religious issue and he wanted her take on it. So Jane got on with her autobiography with her basic, moral, non-religious self. Jane's response to Bill was wonderfully written. In her writing, she says she has no religious belief, but we get a clear sense of the good person she was. She wrote about her life growing up in the New York City Village area. Jane told me that she thought she got a better education in the New York City Village schools than she got from her colleges, Radcliffe and Harvard. One of her schools was called the Little Red Schoolhouse, and one alleged reason for the red tag were false rumors of communist teachers at the school.
Jokingly, she said that if she had a God, it would have been FDR. Any religion would have wanted to have a pastor like Jane, straight, honest, and with a deep sense of what makes a good life. I met Jane at Yale Law School in the late 50s. We were a class of 60 with only 10 women. Later, we continued our friendship when we moved with our respective families to Park Slope, Brooklyn, and both bought houses on 3rd Street, together with Ellen and Sam Sporn, the Pryors, the Grahams, the Jessenkeys, and so many other great neighbors. When we graduated in 1958, Yale urged us to go out and apply our legal education to civil service. Most of us went to law firms with steady salaries, but Jane was a star and 100% a civil servant with every organization she served. There are so many here who respected Jane over so many years for her professional skills, her personal character, her devotion to justice, and her great love for people. Also worthy of comment is Jane's home life. She raised 4 terrific children, and for the rest of her life, she continued to pay diligent attention to each of her children and grandchildren, traveling to their respective locations around the country. She talked about you all with so much pride. Jane's contribution to our nation include the unique organizations that you've been hearing about. Founding Advocates for Children, a service I don't think exists elsewhere. Jane was a founding member and led it for 15 years. Jane knew this city better than anyone and served it in so many ways, from working on the PTA in the 60s to being chosen to sit on several New York City government committees. She worked at the Trust for more than 2 decades, working to support the New York Immigration Coalition. And of course, the Trust dealt with New York City's ongoing problems like racism in its many forms and more. Informally, as we just heard the story, Jane worked with legislators for many years who were writing laws involving large sums of money for public education. I'm too old to remember lots of things, but I do remember that there were laws passed that changed funding to equalize the educations given to children in the suburbs and in New York City. This was one of the many ways Jane influenced the people and the world around her for the better.
You can read more in Jane's own words in an
Biography.
An autobiography. Which was.
I will end.
Yep.
But I'll end here.
Yep.
And my simple saying is I was so lucky and honored to have known Jane, and so grateful for the love that we shared together. Thank you.
Obstacle course here. It is. Hi, I'm going to keep this very brief. As I originally designed it, it was brief. It's going to get briefer because I think people are getting tired and hungry and thirsty. Jane was my good friend, my wonderful friend for decades and decades. I first met her in Park Slope. I had just arrived, my family, which consisted of 3.5 of us. And we moved into 3rd Street. So I was walking down the block with my 2-year-old daughter, and coming towards me was this tall, striking, lithe woman surrounded by a bevy of girls and a little bump in front of her. That was Tommy. The girls were dancing and skipping, and one of them with red hair, her feet never touched the ground. So I smiled, she greeted me in a fairly adult way, and the bevy of girls, there were really only 3, but it looked like 20, surrounded my daughter and said, "Hi, what's your name? How old are you? Are you Catholic or Jewish? She may kill me for saying this, but I don't think my daughter had a clue. So you've heard all of Jane's professional accomplishments. You've heard that as valuable as they were, her friendships were equally valuable. And you heard all the good ways she was a friend. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned much is her wry sense of humor, which stood her in good stead as we were raising children. I think it got harder and harder for her to call on it as her view of life darkened a little bit and took a fairly deep plunge in 2016. As we sat, our wonderful Park Slope group had diminished a lot, and we were down to only a few, but 5 of us were going to meet on election night, and we couldn't. 2 of them couldn't make it because they were sick. So it was me and Jane and Dick, and that was a low moment. But she stayed a terrific friend, and even though, as I think, she felt weighed down particularly by national and international politics and problems, she still took wonderful, wonderful pride and joy in her family, as you've heard. And I didn't get this directly. It was actually to Dick Sexton. With some trepidation, she had gone out to the West Coast visit in California, but because travel had gotten harder for her. After she got there, she was talking to Dick on the phone. And she said, I am so glad I did this. I'm so glad I came. I'm having a wonderful time. I'm very glad she had a wonderful time.
I didn't write a speech because I knew everybody would say everything that I wrote. I'm here with my husband, Sam, with our daughter, Nina, and I'm looking around, and I just want to say, we met Jane because her mother, Till, set us up. We met Till at an art gallery in the village, and she liked to talk and chat up, and we spoke to each other, and I don't know why we told her we were moving to Park Slope. And she said, oh, my daughter lives there. And what's your address going to be? And I told her the address, and I can picture it like it was yesterday. Sam, oops, I'm sorry, that happens when I talk with my hands. All right, I'm going to put my hands behind my back. Sam and I were on the stoop at our house on 3rd Street. And I guess Till had given Jane our address. And Jane came walking down the street with Lou. And he had one of you children was on his shoulders. It couldn't have been you, Emily. So who would have been the next? Who would have been the one on the shoulder? No, it was way before. I think it was you or Jillian. I can still see it as, and then the rest is history. We all became wonderful friends. And as Sandra said, we become the incredibly shrinking group, and it's so, so sad. But I do want to say that Jane was probably the fiercest woman I knew, And she loved all of you family fiercely. And I probably know a lot more about some of the grandchildren than they, but I won't tell. And she just loved you all, and she was a marvelous friend. I'll just tell you this, when our friends started to get sick, like Dorothy Jasinki, Jane would organize that we would go and visit. She wouldn't drop a friend for anything. So that's all. I miss her. And I miss seeing all of you children, and I hope we all keep in touch.
Move this up a little bit. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bernie Graham. And first of all, I want to thank the Stern family for including me in the celebration of the life of their mother, Jane. Yes, it is a celebration, as was pointed out in the emails, more than a memorial, because of Jane's life indeed needs to be celebrated. I'm happy I'm invited to speak, although I think the reason I'm here really is that my mother, Nancy, was a very close and dear friend of Jane's. So unfortunately, Nancy passed away this past February and would love to be here, of course. But I can at least speak to the friendships that Jane had with all of the people here in this room, her children, with her grandchildren. So as I would consider myself a contemporary of Jane's children, Isabel, Jillian, Emily, Tommy, although that sounds strange when you're 61 years old and you're calling yourself a contemporary of other children. Anyway, I mentioned that we should mention our connection to Jane and her family. I'm not sure that's altogether necessary. I consider myself to be almost part of Jane's actual immediate family over all these years spent as neighbors together, and knowing so many people in this room, it seems like we're all family. But to give some background, the Grahams moved to Park Slope in 1962 to live on 4th Street. My father, Jim, and my mom, Nancy, who both passed away. My father passed away very early on, but they had developed a close friendship with the people arriving into Park Slope to renovate brownstones and to change the world. Jane and Lou Stern, Charlie and Jennifer Monahan, Sam and Ellen Sporn, who are here, Ann and Jean Feldman, Bill and Dorothy Jessica, Sandra and Neil Pryor, the Tullys, and many others. If I leave any of you out, please forgive me. There's just so many people that Jane has come into contact with, and it's a big universe. But these families shared a common interest in improving public education, reforming local politics, and raising their families here in Brownstone, Brooklyn. We relied on Jane to straighten out the PTA at PS 321, where I went, my kids went, many people in this room went. In fact, some of my classmates are here, right, Chris? Charlie Monahan and Joe Ferris, we led the call to change our politics here in Brooklyn. And my father, Jim Graham, started an organization, an anti-poverty program called CUSA. There's so many fond memories that I have of sharing holidays with the Sterns. My mother, Nancy, every year would make a point of inviting either the Sterns or the Feldmans to our house for Christmas on 4th Street. And I would ask my mom, I said, why are we always inviting the Feldmans and the Sterns? And she'd say, well, they're Jewish and they have no place else to go. So I'm bringing them in. So that made sense. Together as families, we traveled on vacations together, places like Antigua, St. Martin, and Grossinger's, beautiful Grossinger's of blessed memory. I will never forget the image
of seeing Lou Stern skiing down the slopes of Grossingers in his long London fog trench coat, looking as out of place as a person could be on a ski slope. I have fond memories of all the weddings of the Stern family, Isabel's wedding, Jillian, Emily, Tommy's. They were all in beautiful venues, and Jane couldn't have been happier celebrating the marriages of her children. Since I'm the last one in this program, first of all, I'll try to be brief, but you've already heard about the incredible career and professionalism and activism that Jane participated in fighting for educational equity at Advocates for Children, fighting poverty, supporting the arts and humanities at New York Community Trust. So I don't have to go into that part of Jane's life. Although I would like to point out that based on Jane's commitment to public service, it certainly inspired me to get more into public service and reach towards a career of being a judge in the New York State courts with Jane's help and many of the other people here in this room. What I would like to talk about is some of the things, in addition to her impressive career, that made Jane a very special person. As a mother and a civic advocate, she fought hard for her kids and the rest of us growing up in Park Slope to get quality educations, to help others who needed help. Jane and her family, along with many people here today, felt so strong about education that one of our great memories was keeping PS 321 open during the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teachers' strike in the 1960s, which was an absolutely amazing accomplishment. They kept the building open 24 hours a day because it otherwise would have been locked by the custodians. And it set an example that for all of us growing up in Park Slope, of what we could aspire to. Qualities of fairness, kindness, and honesty were qualities that Jane Stern showed every day. Those qualities guided her own children as well as the rest of us. When I ventured into politics, I knew that I could count on Jane and Lou and their circle of friends. I had to solicit campaign contributions several times. And only jokingly did Dick Sexton give me a hard time about all the fundraisers I had. The reason I mention this is that after becoming a judge, I went to New York City's family court for a few years. You don't have to be a sociologist or a psychologist to see the benefits from coming from a stable family that supports education, provides for their children, and inspires their children to have a healthy and happy life. Unfortunately, many families in Brooklyn do not have those avenues of support, and it is a tragedy, and it should be changed. I consider myself fortunate to have been raised in Park Slope and to have had people like Jane Stern as a role model, professionally and personally. It makes all the difference in the world to have people to guide you and support you and help you along. Jane Stern is someone I will always credit for helping me know right from wrong and how to be a good person. I often joke about Lake Wobegon, the fictitious town where all of the children are above average. Well, that seems to have fit our Park Slope growing up, and especially everybody here in this room. Another part of Jane's life that I always would admire is her friendship with the people like the Feldmans, Sam and Ellen Sporn, Charlie and Jennifer Monahan, Dick and Joan Sexton, Wendy and Willie Maloney, Sandra Neal Pryor, and my mother, Nancy. In fact, I could talk about that friendship, but what you really need to do is look at the pictures on the screen that was shown when we came in here, and you can see the joy that all of these friends had for each other and the moments that they shared here in the Montauk Club, celebrating each other's birthdays, their weddings. They were here at my wedding with Rosemary in 1989. And one of the nicer events I can recall was when Sam Sporn earned some type of international tennis player award, and we were all at Tavern on the Green. You remember that, Sam? I'm sure you still have the trophies. But the friendship between Jane and my mother was especially memorable. Jane was divorced, and my mother, Nancy, was widowed, and both of them were dear friends. Well into their later years, they traveled all over to places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Italy, and Arizona, among other places. Jane and Nancy were always out and about at the theater, movies, museums, restaurants. When Nancy began to decline a few years ago with dreaded Alzheimer's, we had to move Nancy into an Alzheimer's unit at the Bristol Assisted Living Facility in Holtzville, Long Island. Without missing a beat, Jane asked to visit with Nancy. I said, "Are you sure?" I said, "It can be a little unsettling. These Alzheimer's units are kind of grim. People don't have their memory." But she didn't phase Jane. She says, "I'll meet you in Brooklyn. You can drive us out there." I said, "Let's go." So on the long drives out there, it was nice to talk to Jane, where she would talk about her grandchildren. She would ask about my kids. And I really got to know Jane from those trips. But arriving at the Bristol, Jane jumped right in. They were making arts and crafts projects, painting little miniature flower pots, while while live musicians were playing Frank Sinatra music and songs from Phantom of the Opera, which created a rather surreal environment in the Alzheimer's unit. And it didn't deter Jane. She went back 2 or 3 times. This is an example for me of how Jane is one of the kindest people I will ever know. These last few years have been difficult for many people. Jane passed away. Ann and Jean are no longer with us. Joan Sexton, Wendy Maloney, Bill and Dorothy Jessica, Lou Stern, Jennifer Monahan, and Nancy have all passed away. Those we lost have not left us in sadness, but with profound and precise memories. They all accomplished so much and led full lives. Jane's life should be celebrated as well as the others, because they left the rest of us with a foundation of how we can all be good, kind, and better people.
Hi, hello. My name is Valerie Samuel, and most people here don't know me, but I thought I really needed to say something because I am the personally been affected by Jane Stern. And the day I was introduced to the Stern family was one of the best days of my life, which I didn't know at the time. I was Lucian's nanny 23 years ago, so I met Jillian. That day, I knew there was something about her, but little did I know it was going to be so much more. Jane Stern has personally helped me, my family, my son especially, and all the goodness about helping the underprivileged in New York City public schools. It's been just really the best. Because of Jane, my son got a chance. She introduced me to Advocates for Children. Kim, thank you guys so much for all the help. And even after I was not Lucian's nanny, it didn't end. She made phone calls on my son's behalf, went out of her way. And to this day, 23 years later, I'm so fortunate I met Jillian, be part of your family. If it wasn't for your mom, I think I would have done, but I'm not sure how far I would have gotten for helping me, an immigrant, navigate the public school system. Jane was just amazing, kind, generous. With me, somebody she didn't even know was her daughter's nanny. So that tells you the kind of person Jane was. Didn't matter where you came from, who you were. So I just had to say something. I just couldn't let the day go. So, sorry about that. Ooh. Thank you so very much. I think that there was a definite theme. Can you hear me? Okay. Of everything that everybody said. So my mother was, maybe the four of us didn't always think, but the kindest, most generous person who, as her grandchildren said, and I think her children would feel, said whatever she felt, but she just gave so much. Anyway, thank you for coming today. Jillian, Emily, Tom, and I are so glad that at last we're able to celebrate our mother with who's loved and admire all of you. We appreciate all your words. We appreciate all your notes, all your letters, all these past 2 years. You've all captured our mother's essence, a true crusader of human rights, a devoted mother, grandmother, and friend, a beautiful human. While Mom didn't consider Judaism an essential part of who she was, I did write this before Rayla said this, but she regularly practiced one of Judaism's basic tenets, tikkun olam, to repair the world. I think we all can agree that Mom devoted her life to repairing the world, and we are all the better for that. Thank you so much, Mom. Thanks for coming, and please feel free to stay a moment to visit, and by all means, eat a cookie. Thank you.